In the heart of London, on a cool and breezy autumn morning, an elderly man named Thomas Whittaker stood quietly near Buckingham Palace. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his old military cap, its edges frayed from years of wear. The golden letters on the cap were faded, but they still carried the weight of history. Thomas hadn't been to this place in decades, not since the days when he wore his uniform with pride during World War I. But today, something deep inside him had pulled him here, like an invisible thread tying him to the past. The air was crisp, filled with the faint smell of fallen leaves and distant car engines. Around him, life buzzed as usual. Tourists snapped pictures of the Grand Palace, their laughter echoing softly. Children chased pigeons across the square, their giggles blending with the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn carriages passing by. Yet, none of these sounds reached Thomas. He felt disconnected from the lively scene around him, lost in thoughts that only grew heavier with each passing second. Thomas wasn't just any visitor. He was a war veteran, a man who had seen things most people couldn't even imagine. His eyes, though clouded with age, held stories of battles fought, friendships forged, and lives lost. As he stood there, staring at the towering gates of Buckingham Palace, memories began to surface. Memories he had tried so hard to bury over the years. He thought about the trenches, where mud and fear became constant companions. He remembered the cold nights spent under starless skies, listening to the distant boom of artillery. Most of all, he thought about James Carter, his best friend during the war. James had always dreamed of visiting Buckingham Palace one day, joking that maybe the Queen herself would invite them for tea. They had laughed about it, promising each other they'd make the trip together once the war ended. But James never came home. His name was etched on a memorial plaque alongside countless others, a reminder of sacrifices made. As Thomas took a shaky step forward, his heart felt heavy. He knew why he was here, to honor James, to honor all those who didn't get the chance to see peace. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he approached one of the royal guards standing tall and motionless nearby. The guard's red coat and towering bearskin hat made him look larger than life, a symbol of tradition and duty. To everyone else, he might have seemed untouchable, unapproachable, but not to Thomas. With trembling hands, Thomas raised his arm in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't just a gesture. It was everything he couldn't put into words. Respect for the sacrifices of those who came before him, gratitude for the freedoms they fought to protect, and sorrow for the friends he had lost along the way. His salute lingered in the air, silent yet powerful, carrying the weight of decades' worth of emotions. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The chatter of tourists faded into the background, and the world narrowed down to just two figures, an aging veteran and a young guard bound by duty. What happened next would leave everyone present speechless and bring them closer to understanding the true meaning of sacrifice. The morning after the ceremony, Thomas Whittaker passed away peacefully in his sleep. There were no alarms, no frantic calls for help, just a quiet end to a life that had carried so much weight. His family found him seated in his armchair, the photograph of James Carter still clutched gently in his hands. It was as if he had finally completed his journey, fulfilling the promise he made decades ago to honor his friend and all those who never came home. News of his passing spread quickly, reaching every corner of the country and beyond. The same people who had cheered for him weeks earlier now mourned his loss, their hearts heavy with gratitude and grief. Social media lit up once again, this time with tributes pouring in from strangers whose lives had been touched by his story. "Rest in peace, Mr. Whittaker," one post read. "Your salute reminded us what true sacrifice looks like." Another person wrote, "You didn't just keep your promise to James. You kept it for all of us." Thomas's funeral drew crowds larger than anyone expected. Veterans, active duty soldiers, and civilians lined the streets leading to the cemetery, standing shoulder to shoulder under gray skies. Some held flags, others wore poppies pinned to their coats, a symbol of remembrance. As the procession moved slowly through the city, people raised their hands in silent salutes, mirroring the gesture that had sparked it all. Even the royal guards marched in formation, their polished boots clicking against the pavement as they carried Thomas's casket with solemn dignity. At the graveside, the atmosphere was somber yet filled with reverence. A military band played "The Last Post," its haunting notes echoing across the quiet grounds. An officer delivered a eulogy, speaking not just of Thomas's service, but of the ripple effect his actions had created. "He taught us how to remember," the officer said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just with words, but with our hearts. Because of him, we will never forget." As the flag-draped casket was lowered into the earth, a young soldier stepped forward. It was the same guard who had returned Thomas's salute outside Buckingham Palace. He stood at attention, his bearskin hat removed, and placed a single red rose on the grave. Then, breaking rank once more, he knelt briefly before rising to deliver a final salute. The crowd watched in silence, many moved to tears by the raw humanity of the moment. In the days that followed, tributes continued to pour in. Schools held moments of silence in Thomas's memory, while veterans' organizations pledged to carry forward his legacy of remembrance. One group launched a campaign to create a permanent memorial honoring unsung heroes like Thomas, ordinary people who did extraordinary things without seeking recognition. Months later, near the gates of Buckingham Palace, a statue was unveiled. It depicted an elderly veteran saluting a royal guard, capturing the exact moment that had brought the nation to tears. Beneath it, an inscription read, "To those who gave everything, and to those who continue to remember." Visitors often stopped to pay their respects, leaving flowers or handwritten notes at its base. Though Thomas was gone, his story lived on, a poignant reminder that even the smallest acts of gratitude can bridge generations, heal wounds, and leave an indelible mark on the world. His salute hadn't just honored the past, it had inspired the future, ensuring that the sacrifices of men like James Carter would never fade from memory. Weeks after the viral moment at Buckingham Palace, Thomas Whittaker found himself seated in a grand hall filled with hundreds of people. Veterans organizations had organized a special ceremony to honor him, calling it a tribute to those who serve. The room buzzed with energy as attendees took their seats. Families of fallen soldiers, active duty personnel, dignitaries, and even strangers who had been moved by his story. Flags lined the walls, and a podium stood at the center, draped with a Union Jack. Thomas sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wore his old military uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion, though it hung loosely on his frail frame. His cap rested beside him, its faded insignia a quiet testament to years of service. Despite the warmth of the crowd's applause when he entered, he felt uneasy. This kind of attention wasn't something he ever sought or imagined receiving. As speakers took turns at the podium, they spoke of Thomas's bravery, his sacrifices, and the inspiration he had become to so many. One veteran shared how seeing Thomas's salute reminded him of his own friends lost in battle. A young soldier recounted how hearing the story encouraged her to reflect on why she joined the military, to protect freedoms secured by those who came before her. Each speech was heartfelt, but Thomas listened intently, feeling both pride and sorrow. Pride that his actions had sparked such an outpouring of gratitude, and sorrow because he knew the real heroes were the ones no longer here to hear these words. When it was finally his turn to speak, Thomas rose slowly, gripping the edge of the podium for support. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. For a moment, he simply stood there, gathering his thoughts. Then, in a voice steady despite its softness, he began to speak. "I'm not sure I deserve all this," he started, glancing around the room. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just lived through extraordinary times. And I wasn't alone. There were thousands of us, men and women who gave everything they had, often without asking for anything in return." His gaze drifted downward as he continued. "Some came home. Many didn't. My best friend, James Carter, was one of those who didn't make it. He dreamed of visiting this palace someday, maybe shaking hands with the Queen herself. We promised each other we'd come here together when the war ended. But promises made in war don't always last. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to steady himself. I came here today because of him. Because of James, and because of everyone else who never got the chance to see peace. If my salute helped remind people of their sacrifice, then maybe it was worth it. The room erupted into applause, but Thomas didn't linger. He stepped back from the podium, his job done. As he returned to his seat, tears rolled down the cheeks of many in the audience. Some veterans nodded solemnly, while others wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs. Parents hugged their children tighter, whispering reminders about the importance of remembering. That evening, back in his small apartment, Thomas sat alone in his armchair, staring at the photograph of James Carter. The day's events replayed in his mind. The speeches, the applause, the weight of so much gratitude. But none of it could fill the void left by the absence of his friend. With trembling fingers, he traced the edges of the photo, whispering, I kept my promise, Jimmy. I hope you're proud. Though the nation celebrated him, Thomas couldn't shake the bittersweet truth. The recognition came too late for those who mattered most. Still, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, the world would remember them now. What happened next would leave everyone reeling. A final act of remembrance that would bring both closure and heartbreak, ensuring Thomas's legacy would endure long after he was gone. The statue near Buckingham Palace quickly became more than just a monument. It was a symbol of connection, remembrance, and gratitude. Tourists from all over the world paused to take in its details. The weathered face of the elderly veteran, his hand raised in a trembling salute, and the towering figure of the royal guard responding with quiet respect. The inscription beneath it, to those who gave everything, and to those who continue to remember, sparked conversations among visitors, prompting them to reflect on their own lives and the sacrifices made by others. Every day, fresh flowers appeared at the base of the statue. Some were left by veterans paying tribute to fallen comrades. Others came from school children inspired by Thomas's story. Handwritten notes filled the surrounding area, each one carrying a personal message. Thank you for reminding us of what matters. Read one. Another simply said, we won't forget. These small gestures proved that Thomas's legacy wasn't confined to history books or memorials. It lived on in the hearts of ordinary people. The impact of his story extended far beyond London. Schools across the globe began incorporating it into lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering. Teachers used it as a way to connect students to the human side of war, encouraging them to think about the individuals behind the headlines. In classrooms, children wrote letters to veterans, expressing their gratitude and promising to carry forward their stories. One teacher shared how her class started a project called Memory Keepers, where students interviewed local veterans and documented their experiences. It's like Thomas showed us how to listen, she explained. And now we're making sure no one is forgotten. Even decades later, the statue remained a gathering place for annual remembrance events. On Veterans Day, crowds gathered around it, holding candles and singing hymns. Families brought photographs of loved ones who had served, placing them carefully beside the statue. Speeches were given, tears were shed, but there was also laughter, a celebration of lives well lived and sacrifices honored. Each year, someone would recount Thomas's story, ensuring that new generations understood its significance. The young guard who had broken protocol to return Thomas's salute went on to become a mentor within the Royal Guard. He often spoke to new recruits about the importance of remembering why they served, not just as ceremonial figures, but as part of a legacy built on bravery and selflessness. Thomas taught me that our duty isn't just about standing tall, he would say. It's about carrying the weight of those who came before us. Every time we stand here, we're standing for them. As years passed, the memory of Thomas Whittaker grew into something larger than life. Documentaries were made, books were written, and even a film adaptation brought his story to theaters worldwide. Yet through it all, the essence of his journey remained unchanged. a quiet man who sought only to honor his friend, unaware of the profound effect his actions would have on millions. Perhaps the most beautiful outcome was the renewed focus on remembering unsung heroes. Communities came together to uncover stories of local veterans, ensuring their names and deeds were preserved. Memorials sprang up in towns and cities, each one dedicated to those who had given so much yet asked for so little in return. People realized that remembering wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about listening, sharing, and keeping these stories alive in everyday life. In the end, Thomas's salute did more than move a nation. It sparked a movement. It reminded everyone that bravery isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments when someone chooses to honor the past. His legacy became a promise, a vow to never let the sacrifices of men like James Carter fade from memory. And so, though Thomas was gone, his spirit endured. Through the statue, the stories, and the countless acts of remembrance inspired by his life, he ensured that future generations would always know the true cost of freedom and the power of saying thank you. The royal guardsman standing before Thomas was trained to remain perfectly still, no matter what happened around him. His job was to stand tall and silent, a symbol of discipline and tradition. But as Thomas's trembling hand rose in that slow, heartfelt salute, something inside the young guard shifted. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a story, a lifetime of sacrifice wrapped into one simple act. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it moved him. Instead of staying frozen in place as protocol demanded, the guard hesitated for the briefest moment. Then, with precision and care, he raised his own gloved hand in return. The salute was crisp, respectful, and held just a fraction longer than usual. Through the visor of his towering bearskin hat, his eyes locked onto Thomas. For a fleeting second, the two men connected, not through words, but through an unspoken understanding. Both had served their country in different ways, separated by generations but united by a shared sense of duty. The crowd around them noticed immediately. At first, people weren't sure what they were seeing. Some tourists lowered their cameras, confused by the unexpected exchange. Others stopped mid-conversation, drawn in by the unusual sight. A hush fell over the square as more and more people turned their attention to the elderly veteran and the stoic guard. Phones were raised again, this time not to capture selfies or snapshots of the palace, but to record the unfolding moment. "What's happening?" whispered a young woman holding her child's hand. Her voice carried just enough to draw others closer. "I think he's saluting him back," replied an older man nearby, his tone filled with awe. It was rare for anyone to see a royal guard break rank, even in such a small way. These soldiers were known for their unwavering composure, their refusal to react to distractions, whether it was bad weather, cheeky tourists, or even fainting bystanders. Yet here was this young guard, choosing to acknowledge Thomas in a way that defied expectations. It wasn't defiance, it was respect. Pure, unfiltered respect. As the seconds ticked by, Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this. All he wanted was to pay tribute to the memories of those who didn't make it home, to honor James Carter and every other soldier who gave their life for peace. But now, standing face to face with this guard, he realized something profound. His sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. Someone still cared. Someone still understood. The guard, though young, seemed to feel the weight of the moment too. Beneath his polished exterior, he was reminded of why he chose this path. Every early morning drill, every hour spent standing motionless in the cold, it all meant something because of men like Thomas. Without them, there would be no palace to guard, no traditions to uphold. In that instant, the line between past and present blurred. They weren't just a veteran and a guard anymore. They were part of the same enduring legacy. People began whispering among themselves, piecing together fragments of the scene before them. "Is he a veteran?" someone asked. "Look at his cap. He must have served." Another person nodded, adding, "He looks so humble, like he doesn't want attention." Despite the growing buzz, Thomas remained focused on the guard. Neither man spoke, but their mutual respect transcended language. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. What started as curiosity turned into reverence. Strangers exchanged glances, some wiping away tears while others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the raw emotion in the air. When the guard finally lowered his hand, returning to his rigid stance, the spell broke, but only slightly. The crowd continued to watch, captivated. No one knew exactly what had passed between the two men, but everyone could feel its significance. Something powerful had unfolded right before their eyes, something that would stay with them long after they left the square. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. As the guard lowered his hand and resumed his formal posture, Thomas felt a wave of emotions crash over him. The years seemed to peel away, like pages of an old book flipping backward in time. He was no longer standing in front of Buckingham Palace surrounded by tourists. He was back in the trenches, reliving moments he had tried so hard to bury. The smell of damp earth, the sound of distant gunfire, the faces of comrades who had become family. It all came rushing back. His mind lingered on James Carter, his best friend during the war. James had been more than just a fellow soldier. He was the brother Thomas never had. They'd shared everything, their hopes, their fears, their dreams for life after the war. James often joked about meeting the Queen one day, saying how they'd stroll into Buckingham Palace together and maybe even share a cup of tea with royalty. "Imagine that, Tom," James would say with a grin. Two blokes from nowhere, shaking hands with the Queen herself. They had promised each other they'd visit the palace someday once the fighting ended. But promises made in war are fragile things, easily broken by the harsh realities of battle. James didn't make it home. A mortar strike took him on a cold November night, leaving Thomas alone to carry the weight of their shared dream. Now, decades later, Thomas stood where they had once dreamed of being. But instead of joy, he felt a deep ache in his chest. He glanced down at the worn photograph tucked inside his coat pocket, a faded image of him and James, arms flung over each other's shoulders, smiling despite the chaos around them. Tears welled up in his eyes as he whispered softly, almost too low for anyone to hear, "This one's for you, Jimmy." Unbeknownst to Thomas, the young guard noticed the subtle change in his expression. Though the guard's face remained impassive, his sharp eyes caught the glimmer of moisture forming in the corners of Thomas's eyes. He saw the way the elderly man's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of memories too heavy to bear. For the first time in his service, the guard felt truly connected to the history he represented. These weren't just stories in textbooks or names etched on memorials. They were real people with real lives and real pain. The crowd around them continued to grow quieter, sensing the depth of emotion unfolding before them. Mothers held their children closer, while fathers exchanged knowing looks. Even the playful chatter of teenagers hushed as they realized something extraordinary was happening. Some wiped away tears, while others simply stared, unable to look away. Thomas finally broke his gaze from the guard and turned toward the palace gates. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if every movement required effort. Yet there was a sense of peace in his demeanor, a quiet acceptance of the past, mingled with gratitude for the present. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of James, holding it close to his heart. "I kept my promise, mate," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I came here for both of us." The words were meant only for himself, but they carried a resonance that touched everyone within earshot. The young guard, still standing rigidly in place, felt a lump rise in his throat. Despite his training to remain stoic, he couldn't help but feel humbled by the sheer humanity of the moment. Here was a man who had given so much, asking for nothing in return. And yet, through this simple act of remembrance, he reminded everyone of the sacrifices that paved the way for the world they now lived in. For the first time, the guard allowed himself to think about what it truly meant to serve, not just as a ceremonial figurehead guarding a palace, but as part of a legacy built on courage and sacrifice. He thought about the countless soldiers who had come before him, Men like Thomas and James, whose bravery ensured that places like Buckingham Palace could stand tall as symbols of hope and resilience. As Thomas stepped back, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. It started with a few claps, then grew louder, filling the square with a sound that echoed off the stone walls of the palace. Strangers patted Thomas on the shoulder, offering words of thanks and admiration. But Thomas barely heard them. His focus remained on the photograph in his hand, the memory of James alive in his heart. What happened next would bring everyone to tears, not just because of the sorrow it carried, but because of the profound beauty of remembering those who gave everything. The applause from the crowd lingered in the air, but Thomas didn't stay to soak it in. He tucked the photograph of James back into his coat pocket and took a step back, his eyes still fixed on the ground. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, and though he appreciated the recognition, he wasn't seeking admiration. All he wanted was to honor the memory of his friend, and perhaps find some small measure of peace for himself. But then something unexpected happened. The young guard, who had resumed his rigid stance after returning the salute, broke protocol once again. This time, he didn't just stand there silently. With careful precision, he stepped forward slightly, leaning just enough to lower his voice so only Thomas could hear. "Thank you," he said, his tone steady yet filled with emotion. "For everything." Those 3 words hit Thomas like a tidal wave. They were simple, almost ordinary, but they carried a depth that struck straight to his core. No one had thanked him like that in decades, not since the war ended, not since the parades and speeches faded into distant memories. In those 2 syllables, the guard expressed gratitude not just for Thomas's service, but for the sacrifices of every soldier who came before him. Thomas blinked, startled by the raw sincerity in the guard's voice. His throat tightened, making it impossible to respond immediately. Instead, he nodded stiffly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to vanish. It was as if the bustling square, the clicking cameras, and the murmuring crowd melted away, leaving only the 2 men standing face to face, one representing the past, the other the present. The crowd noticed the exchange, even though they couldn't hear what was said. Phones were raised higher, capturing every detail. People leaned closer, trying to decipher the significance of the moment. A journalist in the crowd, a young woman with a notebook in hand, recognized Thomas instantly. She had seen photographs of him in archives while researching stories about World War I veterans. Her heart raced as she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. "Excuse me, sir," she called out gently, approaching Thomas with cautious steps. "Are you Thomas Whitaker, the war veteran?" Thomas turned toward her, his expression wary but kind. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes," he replied softly. "That's me." The journalist introduced herself, explaining that she wrote articles about history and remembrance. She asked if she might speak with him, hoping to learn more about his story. At first, Thomas was reluctant. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and he certainly didn't consider himself remarkable. But something about the earnestness in her voice made him reconsider. Slowly, he agreed, offering fragments of his life, his time in the trenches, the camaraderie among soldiers, the losses that still haunted him. As he spoke, the crowd grew quieter, hanging onto every word. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering explanations about the importance of listening. Teenagers, usually glued to their phones, looked up with wide eyes, captivated by the vivid details of a world long gone. Even the royal guards nearby seemed affected, their stoic expressions softening ever so slightly. Thomas paused often, his voice cracking under the weight of emotions he hadn't confronted in years. When he mentioned James Carter, his best friend who never made it home, there wasn't a dry eye in the square. The journalist scribbled notes furiously, knowing she was documenting something far greater than a single story. It was a piece of living history. By the time Thomas finished speaking, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the square. The crowd erupted into applause again, this time louder and more heartfelt. Strangers approached him, shaking his hand and thanking him for sharing his experiences. Children handed him flowers, their innocent smiles a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. Through it all, Thomas remained humble. He insisted he wasn't special, that countless others had done far more and received far less acknowledgement. Yet he couldn't deny the impact his presence had on those around him. In breaking his silence and sharing his story, he reminded everyone of the human cost behind freedom and the importance of remembering those who sacrificed everything. What happened next would ripple far beyond the square, touching hearts across the nation and reigniting a collective appreciation for the brave souls who shaped the world we live in today. Within hours, the story of Thomas Whitaker and the Royal Guard spread like wildfire. The journalist who had spoken to Thomas wrote an article that night, pouring her heart into every sentence. She titled it, "A Salute That Moved a Nation," capturing not just the moment itself, but the emotions it stirred in everyone who witnessed it. By morning, the piece was published online and shared thousands of times across social media platforms. People were captivated by the humanity of the exchange, a quiet act of respect between two generations bound by service. Videos of the encounter went viral almost instantly. Tourists who had filmed the scene uploaded their clips, adding heartfelt captions about how the moment touched them. One video, shot from close range, showed Thomas's trembling salute and the guard's unexpected response. The clip ended with Thomas whispering something under his breath, his lips barely moving as tears glistened in his eyes. Comments flooded in, many simply saying, "This gave me chills," or "I'll never forget this." Hashtags began trending worldwide. Hashtag Veterans Legacy, hashtag Never Forget, and hashtag The Salutithat Movidus. People started sharing their own stories. Photos of grandparents in uniform, letters written by soldiers long gone, and memories of loved ones who served. A woman posted a picture of her father's war medals, writing, "He never talked much about what he did, but I know he would have been proud to see this today." Another person shared a black and white photograph of two young men standing side by side, explaining, "My uncle died in Vietnam. This reminds me of him and all the friends he left behind." Schools took notice too. Teachers incorporated the story into history lessons, using it as a way to connect students to the sacrifices made by previous generations. In one classroom, a teacher played the video for her students and asked them to write reflections. One boy wrote, "I didn't really think about wars before, but now I feel like I should say thank you to people like Mr. Whitaker. It makes me want to be brave like him someday." Even celebrities joined in, amplifying the message. An actor known for his roles in war films tweeted, "This is what true heroism looks like. Not glory, not fame, just quiet courage and remembering those we've lost." His post reached millions, sparking even more conversations about the importance of honoring veterans. Meanwhile, veterans organizations reached out to Thomas, eager to celebrate his life and legacy. They invited him to speak at memorials, parades, and events dedicated to remembering fallen heroes. At first, Thomas hesitated. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight. He never had been. But when they explained that sharing his story could inspire others to remember and honor those who served, he reluctantly agreed. Thomas also received messages from current and former soldiers, thanking him for reminding them why they chose to serve. One email stood out to him. It was from a soldier stationed overseas, who wrote, "Sir, your salute reminded me that our duty isn't just about following orders. It's about carrying forward the sacrifices of those who came before us. Thank you for keeping their memory alive." Back in London, the young guard involved in the exchange faced questions from his superiors about breaking protocol. Instead of punishing him, however, they praised his actions, recognizing the profound impact it had on the public. Encouraged by his commanding officer, the guard gave a brief interview, speaking candidly about how meeting Thomas changed his perspective. "It's easy to get caught up in the routine of guarding the palace," he admitted. "But seeing someone like Mr. Whitaker reminded me of the bigger picture, the reason we stand here every day. We're protecting a legacy built by people like him. As the days passed, the story continued to resonate deeply with people around the globe. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace addressed to Thomas, each filled with gratitude and admiration. Some came from families of soldiers who had died in battle, expressing how his salute helped them heal wounds they thought would never close. Others were from younger generations, promising to carry the torch of remembrance forward. Through it all, Thomas remained humble, deflecting praise whenever possible. "I'm no hero," he told anyone who asked. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." Still, he couldn't deny the power of what had happened that day. What began as a personal pilgrimage to honor James Carter had become something far greater, a movement that united strangers through shared gratitude and reflection. And yet, despite the outpouring of love and recognition, Thomas knew the true weight of his journey wasn't over. There was still unfinished business in his heart, memories he hadn't fully confronted. Little did anyone know, the next chapter of his story would bring both closure and heartbreak in ways no one expected.